Greetings, humans of the internet. Welcome once again to Bowtie Talks. I, of course, am your excellent host, Luke Johnson, coming to you as usual from my undisclosed location in Midwest USA with some more historic insights. And I don't know about some of you listeners, but I enjoy a good book. And as many readers know, many books have been adapted into movies. However, in some cases, the movies are not always that faithful. This got me wondering about some of the differences between some of the most famous adaptations and the books from which they were adapted. And so today I will be looking at some of the most famous movies based on books and how they differ from their source material. And I thought I would start things off with Paramount's Forrest Gump. That's right, some of you may not have known that Forrest Gump was based on a book. To begin things, Forrest is very different physically in the book. In the book, he is described as having a more athletic build. He described himself as 6'6", 262 pounds. Also, in the book, Forrest's father did not leave the family. He died shortly after Forrest was born. Also, Forrest and his mother did not live in a family mansion that his mother inherited. He grew up below the poverty line. However, like the movie, she did rent the house out to boarders. Another key difference is in the book, he does not have bad legs. So there was no iconic run, Forrest, run scene in the book. And Forrest attacks bullies rather than running away from them, since he is obviously much larger in the book. While Forrest does meet Jenny in the first grade and walks her home, Jenny's father is not abusive, and Forrest's time with her during this period is relatively short-lived as he is transferred to special school within the first grade. However, he meets Jenny again after leaving the special school because he is allowed to matriculate into high school during the 9th grade. Also, interestingly, Jenny is not really that big of a character in the book because, unlike the movie, Forrest flunked out of college and he did not enlist in the army. He was drafted to Vietnam, and they both move on. And in the novel, Forrest also has different introductions to Bubba and Lieutenant Dan. In the case of the novel, Lieutenant Dan was not Forrest's commanding officer. The two met while Forrest was recovering in the hospital, and Forrest met Bubba while attending college. However, Bubba did die in Vietnam, just like in the movie, and it is still Forrest's memory of Bubba that inspires him to begin the shrimping business. However, in a turn of events, he does not give the business to Lieutenant Dan, but rather to Bubba's family. The movie also made some big changes to Forrest's personality. In the book, he was shown to be kind of hard-nosed and cynical. And as is often the case in movies, some plot points had to be taken out. For example, in the book, Forrest is shown to be an absolute mathematical genius, but terrible at everything else academic. One of the biggest plot lines that was taken out of the movie was Forrest was recruited by NASA in the book to be an astronaut. He trains with a woman named Major Janet Fritsch, who is supposed to be the first woman in space, along with a female orangutan named Sue, who was accidentally replaced by an aggressive male orangutan, which is also named Sue. And the orangutan is responsible for crashing their spaceship into the jungles of New Guinea. And here they must contend with cannibals. However, Janet Fritsch falls in love with one, while another teaches Forrest how to play chess. None of these made it into the movie. However, one thing that did make it from book to movie was the iconic line, "I gotta pee." However, in the book, it is said many times. And another thing that did make it to the movie, kind of, was the iconic box of chocolates line. Now, everyone knows the movie line is, "Mama always said life was like a box of chocolates." However, the first line in the book was, "Let me say this, being an idiot is no box of chocolates." Another thing that was changed from book to movie was Forrest's son. Forrest finally learns, much like in the movie, that Jenny has a son and he is the father. However, the ending of the book is not quite as happy. Jenny does not die, she lives, and Forrest is content with Jenny raising her and Forrest's son with another man. Forrest has given all his money away, and along with Lieutenant Dan and the orangutan named Sue, settles in New Orleans and becomes a street performer, basically begging for a living. And interestingly, the success of the movie led the author Winston Groom to write a sequel in 1995 called Gump and Company, which was optioned to make a film. However, the author Winston Groom made it intentionally hard to adapt. For one thing, in the book, Forrest meets Tom Hanks, and the movie Forrest Gump is treated like a biopic. This now brings us to another famous adaptation, and that, of course, is The Wizard of Oz. And well, folks, stick with me because there are many, many differences from the book to the movie. For one thing, in the book, Oz is a real place and not a dream that Dorothy had. And Dorothy's shoes are made of silver, not rubies. As to why these two specific changes were made, MGM thought that its audience would be too sophisticated to accept Oz as being a real place, and the shoes were changed from silver to rubies because of the Technicolor sequence. And also, the alter egos of the Lion, the Tin Man, and the Scarecrow were solely the inventions of the MGM movie. And the Wicked Witch of the West and the Wizard do not have Midwestern counterparts. And, as we will soon learn, the book itself was actually quite graphic for a children's novel. The Tin Man was once a real man. He fell in love with a Munchkin girl, and their romance was thwarted by an old woman who lived with the girl and wanted her to remain at home. The old woman enlisted the help of the Wicked Witch of the East, who put a spell on the man's axe so that it chopped off all of his limbs and head and cut his torso and heart in two. And when this happened, the man replaced each part of his body with 10 limbs, but ended up without a heart. Another detail that did not make it from book to movie was the fact that in the book, the witch has only one eye. Now, L. Frank Baum did not go into much detail in describing the witch's physical appearance, except saying that she had one all-seeing eye that scanned the land for Dorothy and her friends. Also, the wizard appeared to each of the travelers in a different form. Now, in the movie, the luminous head of Oz sees all of them at once. However, in the original, each of the four friends visits Oz separately, and Oz takes a different form for each of them. Now, for Dorothy, he does indeed appear as a giant glowing head, and I quote, much bigger than the head of the biggest giant. To the Scarecrow, he appears as a beautiful woman. To the Tin Man, he appears as a fearsome beast, which is nearly as big as an elephant with 5 eyes in its face. And to the Cowardly Lion, the wizard appears as a ball of fire. And in the book, The Wizard of Oz, the witch was not responsible for the poppy field. And actually, these flowers don't need much magical help at all. Poppies have long been connected with sleep-inducing effect, and there's an excellent reason for this. Poppy latex, which is a milky fluid that oozes out of the seed pod when cut, contains morphine, codeine, thebaine, papaverine, noscapine, and trace amounts of opium. And in the book and the movie, Dorothy and the lion doze off after smelling the flowers. And interestingly, as a result of this, for the longest time, I thought that opium was a sedative. And the Emerald City changed very much from book to movie. And people have to wear sunglasses inside the Emerald City in the book. The Emerald City of the book is much more dazzling than that of the movie, because it's bejeweled with so many emeralds that its inhabitants must wear sunglasses all the time. These shades are more than a fashion statement. They are actually locked on behind the wearers' heads to protect them from being blinded by the gems. And when Dorothy kills the witch, she does so intentionally. She threw water on the witch on purpose after she tried to steal Dorothy's silver shoes. Also removed from the movie was a scene in the book in which the Tin Woodsman saves the life of the Queen of Field Mice by chopping off the head of a mountain lion who is pursuing her. And he is so knighted, not making this up. And here's something for the more keen-eyed observers. In the movie, before Dorothy takes a walk on the yellow brick road, Glinda the Good Witch kisses her on the forehead. Now, the movie does not make much of this. However, in the novel, Glinda's kiss leaves a protective mark which is visible to all, which eventually gets Dorothy and her friends in to see Oz, and later on prevents the flying monkeys from killing her. When the house is picked up by a tornado, Dorothy does not faint. Now, as most people know, the film stages Dorothy's time in Oz is an elaborate dream brought on by the tornado when she receives a nasty knock on the head from a loose window and passes out. However, as I said before, in the book, Oz is a real place. Now, Dorothy does doze off as the house is borne aloft by the twister in the book. However, she is fully conscious for the return journey back to Kansas, during which she is whirled up into the air, and I quote, so swiftly that all she could see or feel was the wind whistling past her ears. Just before she lands back in Kansas, however, the silver slippers fall off, lost in the desert forever. However, after all of this, as a writer, I encourage you all to read these books yourself. There are many, many other differences, which I'm sure you will soon discover if you read the books yourself. And I know it's said that the book is always better than the movie. However, Forrest Gump is the sole exception to this I've ever been able to find. However, that is not saying that it is a bad book. It's just different. I just didn't like it very much. However, someone out there might like it. However, the book, The Wizard of Oz, definitely does get my stamp of approval. I fell in love with it when I read it first in the 3rd grade. It stayed in my mind ever since. And I hope to someday read the entire series. Adventures. Yes, there is a full series by L. Frank Baum. So far, I've just read the first book, but I'd like to read all of them, which is quite an undertaking because I understand there are many. And if anyone is interested, the 1985 sequel to The Wizard of Oz, called Return to Oz, is a much faithful adaptation of the original source material. It is a bit darker, and perhaps that's what turned people off to it when it first came out. However, it is still a good movie, and I recommend it to anyone who would like to know what the books are like. And while you're at it, why don't you get Gump and Company as well? I have read bits and pieces of it, and I must say I do like it. So goodbye, God bless, and good reading, I will say to you now.